Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Agape Livecast. This is part 3 of a 6-part series in the series, Whose Church Is It Really? In part 3 today, we're going to look at the 501c3 and answer the question, what it is and how is the church entangled in the 501c3? But if you have not watched parts 1 and 2 of this series, I ask you to do that because it really will give you a better foundation. So I want to thank you for joining me today in part 3 of this series, looking at the 501c3. At the end of part 2, I answered the question, does the government have the right to shut the doors of the place where I worship? And if you watched all of part 1 and part 2, you probably already knew the answer to that question before I gave it. And the answer, unfortunately, is a resounding yes if your church is incorporated and if it wants to. The government, when push comes to shove, has the right to shut down the doors of any business. Now, of course, it cannot shut down the doors of a church because churches are people. They're not businesses. Now, what this does is it causes the church to lose their rights and freedoms when they incorporate. Not just because the government is evil, but mostly because the church has not acted with discernment. The government didn't come in and take away those rights, especially during the last 2 years during this pandemic. We willingly gave them up a long time ago when we incorporated and we signed on the dotted line and we gave away our rights for some benefits. Now remember the saying that I told you to remember, that with the shekels come the shackles, and that nothing is free. Well, today I'm going to look a little bit more specifically at a certain aspect of how the church has given up its rights and its freedoms. And this is the 501c3. And honestly, this has been done in a much more ignorant way than the incorporation of the church. Now, I say this because whereas you actually do get some benefits from incorporation, now I don't believe it's worth it, but you do actually get some benefits. You actually get nothing from the 501c3 except for some convenience if you get audited. But what you have to give up is staggering, and the penalties are even more staggering. And what you risk is mind-blowing. Most churches in America have organized as what are known as 501c3 tax-exempt religious organizations. This change in American law is what is known as the Johnson Amendment, and it was done by LBJ not to help the church, but to silence it. Churches were only added to the section of 501c3 of the tax code in 1954, and up until 1954, it was understood by constitutional law that the church was automatically tax-exempt. Now, Johnson passed this off as a favor to churches, but it isn't. Again, with the shekels come the shackles. So what are the shackles? The shackles are the free speech rights of the church, or rather, I should say, the lack thereof. So I want to let the IRS speak for itself. This is from the tax guide for religious organizations from the IRS, and this is an example from page 8. Minister C is the minister of Church 1. The section 501c3 organization, Church 1, publishes a monthly church newsletter that is distributed to all church members. In each issue, Minister C has a column entitled My Views. The month before the election, Minister C states in the My Views column, it is my personal opinion that candidate U should be reelected. For that one issue, Minister C pays from his personal funds for the portion of the cost of the newsletter attributed to the My Views column. Now, even though he paid part of the cost of the newsletter is the official publication of the church. Because the endorsement appeared in the official publication of the church, it constitutes political campaign intervention by the church. So the IRS states this. Key factors in determining whether communication results in political campaign intervention include the following: whether the statement identifies one or more candidates for a given public office, whether the statement expresses approval or disapproval for one or more candidates' positions and or actions, whether the statement is delivered close in time to the election, whether the statement makes reference to voting or an election, whether the issues addressed in the communication have been raised as an issue distinguishing candidates for a given office, whether the communication is part of an ongoing series of communications by the organization on the same issue that are made independent of the timing of any election, and whether the timing of the communication and identification of the candidate are related to a non-electoral event such as scheduled vote on specific legislation by an office holder who also happens to be a candidate for public office. So if you violate any of this and you have taken a 501c3, you have violated your 501c3. So what is the penalty for violating your 501c3? First, the IRS will hold the organization responsible for back taxes for that taxable period that the violation occurred. And your organization is also going to lose its tax-exempt status. Second, and even more scary, the IRS will hold the board of directors of a 501c3 accountable for operating under the regulations and limitations of that 501c3. The board of directors, since they are directly responsible for this business known as the church, can face intermediate sanctions penalties individually. And these come in the form of an excise tax. Initially, the IRS can face each board member up to 25% of the benefit received. In other words, whatever tax break that organization received, your church. These fines can reach up to 200% of the damages of the nonprofit if they do not act quickly enough. And that comes from the board members directly, not the organization. Now, I believe the cap on this is $20,000, but I'm not certain. So if you are a board member of a church and your church violates the 501c3, you could be on the hook to the IRS for upwards of $20,000. And the IRS calls board members who have not stopped these violations disqualified persons. The IRS states this: it is not necessary that the person actually exercise substantial influence, only that the person be in the position to do so. So this is a lot of risk. For what? What is the benefit? Absolutely nothing. Now, most churches are smart enough and smarter than Minister C to get themselves into trouble, and they know not to campaign directly from the pulpit, and they know not to put it in a newsletter. So that they believe that they are not exposed to a lot of risk. But what they have forgotten is that all official church functions are off limits to campaigning or political speech by any member in church leadership. They can't even talk about the issues as we saw in the list. If they're getting brought up for a vote and it's by a member of the government, you can't even bring it up. And I am going to give you an example here where many churches have violated their 501c3 already. First of all, I can tell you personally, I have witnessed churches violate their 501c3 on both sides of the political spectrum, and I've seen it from the pulpit from both parties. But here is a couple of examples that you may have not thought of. First, maybe you have a church that has small groups, their home Bible studies, and these groups are official groups of the church. So they're not something that somebody started up, but they're official groups of the church. And they could even be Sunday school classes. Well, I want to give you a scenario. It's October 2024 and election season's underway, and you're at your small group or your Sunday school class, and your small group leader or your Sunday school teacher, acting in their official capacity for the church during your group time, makes a statement: we must vote for candidate B. We cannot re-elect candidate A. They have just violated the 501c3. Now, let's suppose you have a guest at your group who does not share your political opinions. And since one, you do not have freedom of speech because you are a 501c3, and two, you're actually now more worried about politics than you are the gospel, they report you to the IRS. What can happen? Well, as I discussed earlier, your church can possibly, perhaps, be subject to back taxes for that taxable year. They can lose their tax-exempt status, and the board members can be subject to a 25% excise tax. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say your church has a budget of $300,000. They could owe upwards of $50,000 in back taxes, and each board member could owe upwards of $12,500 in excise taxes. If the church can't pay that within the taxable year, then the board members will be given an excise tax of upwards of $20,000, which I believe, again, is the cap. Another scenario is this. Let's say we're close to the election and you decide to have an evangelistic event. Someone who is in church leadership and part of the program decides that they're going to wear their Trump 2024 hat or maybe their Biden 2024 hat while speaking or even playing in the band for the event. You are in essence campaigning. The same penalties apply. The church is liable for back taxes and the board can be hit with an excise tax. Why? Because as a member of the board, you were in the position to stop it. And the church should know better. You have to ask yourselves, why are you doing this? Why are you exposing yourself to this risk? Especially when most of you believe the government is only going to get increasingly more hostile to the church. Again, churches were only added to this section of the tax code in 1954. Churches are automatically tax-exempt organizations. But don't take my word for it. We read again in the tax guide for churches and religious organizations, but this time on page 3, that churches that meet the requirements in section 501c3 are automatically considered tax exempt and are not required to apply for or obtain recognition of tax exempt status from the IRS. Also, according to 508c1a, we read what is known as the mandatory exception rule. And it states that subsections A and B of the 501c3 shall not apply to churches, their integrated auxiliaries, and conventions or the associations of the churches. In the words of Steve Nestor, who was an IRS senior revenue officer, he said this, "I am not the only IRS employee who's wondered why churches go to the government and seek permission to be exempted from a tax they didn't know to begin with, and to seek a tax deduction status that they have always had anyways. Many of us have marveled at how church leaders want to be regulated and controlled by an agency of government that most Americans have prayed would just get out of their lives. Churches are in an amazingly unique position. They don't seem to know or appreciate the implications of what it would mean to be free from government control." So why is the church exempt from this? It's as simple as the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for the redress of grievances. Notice the very direct wording. Congress shall make no law. That means they cannot make a law directing the IRS. But they can play hard and fast with the rules and make it tricky and make it difficult. And this is what the 501c3 does. And so churches have decided to be lazy, in my opinion, and to take the convenient route and to take a 501c3 in exchange for giving up their First Amendment rights. Because here's the deal. All the 501c3 does is it makes it easier for you during an audit. That's it. If you do not have a 501c3 and you are audited, all you have to do is prove that the donations were used in a tax-exempt manner and that you are a church. Well, if you are truly a church and you are being honest, you are doing that already. And let me dispel another common myth. See, all donations to any church, even if they are not taking a 501c3, are automatically tax deductible and can be claimed on your taxes. See, a lot of people say, well, if I don't have a 501c3, my people cannot take the tax deduction. That's false. This is straight from the IRS. Donors are allowed to claim a charitable deduction for donations to a church that meets the Section 501c3 requirements, even though the church has neither sought nor received IRS recognition that is tax exempt. If you are keeping proper records, which you should be doing anyways, and the church keeps proper records, which it should also do, then you're good. You do not have to give up any of your rights just so you can have some benefits. Now, where Agent Nestor has wondered, I also have too. I'm amazed at the number of people in our churches that say they love their freedom. They say they love the Constitution, and they say they love the First Amendment, and that they also say that they do not trust the government. But yet they have willingly given up their freedoms, and they've given up their First Amendment rights and their other rights, and they have yoked themselves together to a government that they do not trust. And on the one hand, they want freedom to speak out against the government. But on the other hand, they have given the government the absolute right to enforce an excise tax on both their church and them personally if they say something against them at the wrong place and the wrong time. And this makes absolutely no sense to me. The only explanation to me is this: the devil is very cunning. He is a roaring lion seeking a prey, and he has found it. And it is just a matter of time before he devours. And I believe this is also the result of our current church structures. And that will be the topic of part 4 of this series, whether or not our churches are operating within a biblical model. So I want to thank you for joining me for part 3 of this 6-part series. And please remember to like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you, and God bless. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this edition of Agape Lifecast. And whether you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, I ask that you do me a favor. Please like the video and share it. And if you haven't already done so, please like the Agape Lifecast Facebook page and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, may God richly bless you and keep you.